April 25th, 1945. Magdeburg, Germany. The Elbe River. The war was collapsing in on itself, a hurricane of steel and fire that had nowhere left to run. On this day, as the Soviets slammed against Berlin from the east and the Americans pressed their final offensive from the west, a German officer, a general staff spokesman no less, made his final chilling assessment of the conflict. General Lieutenant Kurt Dittmar, the voice the German public had trusted for years to interpret the grim reality of the Eastern Front, crossed the Elbe River under a white flag. He came to surrender himself and his son to Captain Henry Abbes of the U.S. Army's 117th Regiment. Dittmar, a man who had publicly dismissed the Western Allies as soft, their industry as bloated with consumerism, and their fighting spirit as weak, stepped onto the western bank of the river and into a world he could no longer comprehend. His surrender was a final, symbolic admission of defeat, not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of economic reality. It was a shock that rippled through hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war who, by the spring of 1945, found themselves not in the scorched earth of Soviet captivity, but on the vast, untouched plains of America. These men, veterans of the Afrika Korps, Luftwaffe aircrews, and infantry from the collapsing Western Front, had been fed on a steady diet of Nazi propaganda. They believed America was a decadent, culturally inferior nation, paralyzed by internal divisions and utterly incapable of projecting serious, sustained military power across two oceans. Their military intelligence, honed by years of success in Europe, had critically underestimated the true magnitude of the foe. The initial prisoners, scooped up after the Tunisian campaign in 1943, were the first to encounter the staggering truth. They shipped out of North Africa expecting the meager rations and harsh conditions that defined European captivity. Instead, they disembarked onto the shores of the United States, a continent that appeared completely untouched by the carnage of war. There were no blackouts. Cities glowed with careless, blinding light. The infrastructure was intact, the roads smooth, the railway system an astonishingly efficient grid of endless freight lines. Imagine the young Afrika Korps grenadier, barely 20, who had seen his war grind to a halt in the dust of Tunisia. He'd faced the constant gnawing shortage of fuel, spare parts and ammunition, the fatal German Achilles heel. His commanders had assured him that the vast American industrial apparatus was slow, too distant, and too obsessed with refrigerators and automobiles to pose a true military threat. Then, they started seeing the trains. The logistics of moving nearly 400,000 prisoners across America required a vast network of rail transport. As the prisoners were shuttled from intake camps near the ports to hundreds of new compounds scattered across 46 states, they watched the American landscape scroll past their train windows. What they saw was a production machine running at an impossible, unceasing pace. The sight of entire trainloads of tanks, Shermans, M4s, stacked so high and long that the convoy seemed to stretch to the horizon, shredded the last remnants of their ideological confidence. The Shermans were a tank the Wehrmacht had often derided as mechanically primitive compared to the superior German Panther or Tiger. But here, the former prisoners saw them not in isolated combat, but as an overwhelming deluge, an infinite stream of replacement steel. The German system, built on quality and efficiency, required a meticulous, slow process of production, where every bolt and weapon was a precision instrument. The American system, by contrast, seemed to operate on a principle of absolute brutal scale. It did not merely produce, it spewed out material. Take the testimony of one prisoner, former Oberfeldwebel Heinz Richter, captured in Italy. He worked on a Texas farm in 1944. He later recalled his shock at the American agricultural machine. Not a single farmer with a few acres, but vast, mechanized ranches where a single man drove a colossal tractor that accomplished in an hour what a dozen German farm laborers struggled to finish in a day. Even the farm's waste, the casual, massive excess of food, spoke to a level of abundance completely foreign to a Europe already tightening its belt under years of rationing and constant scarcity. Nazi propaganda had described the American home front as demoralized, struggling under the weight of war. The reality was a prosperous, working populace, not just maintaining their standard of living, but in many cases improving it through full employment and high wages. The factory workers, the engineers, the truck drivers, the very people making the war effort possible, were not starving or oppressed. They were fueling the greatest industrial output in world history. This was the first strategic realization. The German military machine, for all its vaunted quality and innovation, was doomed to be drowned in an ocean of American quantity. Hitler's entire strategy of blitzkrieg depended on defeating his enemies before they could mobilize their industrial capacity. America, however, was an enemy whose mobilization had been underway for years, long before Pearl Harbor, as the arsenal of democracy began supplying the Allies under the Lend-Lease Act. Now that arsenal was being unleashed on Germany itself. The German war machine was designed to achieve a swift knockout blow, to win before the other side could get up off the canvas. They never planned for a sustained, total war against an enemy whose resources, manpower, and distance were effectively limitless. The sight of America's internal strength, a nation of unparalleled prosperity and material resources, far from the front lines and safe from their bombers, was an existential shock. The strategic consequence of this realization was devastating to the Wehrmacht's morale. If the Wehrmacht had been fighting an enemy, a finite army that could be defeated, they were now confronted with a force of nature, an industrial leviathan that simply manufactured victory. This shock manifested most acutely in two areas: the air war and armored warfare. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, had promised German soldiers air superiority. By 1944, however, the sky above the Reich was black with American and British bombers. Prisoners who were downed pilots or anti-aircraft gunners were often flown to America. The sheer number of aircraft they saw in maintenance depots and on the tarmac of places like Fort Dix, New Jersey, was stupefying. Germany struggled to produce complex, high-performance fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet, but they could never produce them fast enough or fuel them adequately. The Americans, by contrast, were stamping out B-24 Liberators and P-51 Mustangs on an assembly line model. Factories like Willow Run in Michigan could reportedly turn out a bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. For a captured German pilot, like Lieutenant Klaus Merton of Jagdgeschwader 27, who had watched his squadron slowly wither away due to irreplaceable losses, the sight of 1,000 P-51s neatly lined up, ready to be shipped, was not just disheartening. It was proof that the Reich had gambled everything on a short war and lost the moment the industrial clocks of America started ticking. The moment the industrial clocks of America started ticking, the war's strategic trajectory was sealed. A bitter truth the captured officers found impossible to refute. The intellectual elite among the POWs, generals, staff officers, and engineers, struggled to reconcile their belief in Germany's technical and tactical superiority with the brutal arithmetic of American production. Take the case of armored warfare. German tank design was generally acknowledged as superior on a one-to-one basis. The Tiger and the Panther outclassed the American Sherman in both firepower and armor protection. Yet this qualitative edge was a candle flickering against a tidal wave. For every Tiger tank Germany produced, the United States manufactured perhaps 20 M4 Shermans. Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, a distinguished panzer commander and staff officer, later wrote that the key to Germany's collapse was not simply superior Allied forces, but the inexhaustible flood of material. Mellenthin described the battle for the West as one where the Germans were consistently forced to exchange one of their tanks for 2 or 3 Allied tanks, a kill ratio they could sustain for a while, but which mathematically led only to annihilation. Here, in America, the prisoners saw the source of that inexhaustible flood firsthand. They worked alongside American civilians in the vast, almost empty landscapes of Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, assisting with labor shortages in agriculture and logging, a provision allowed under the Geneva Convention. In these remote locations, the stark contrast between the two nations was often even more apparent than in the industrial centers. A former tank mechanic, Feldwebel Helmut Fichter, was assigned to a cotton farm in Arizona. Fichte, who had spent his adult life maintaining complex, high-maintenance panzers, was astounded by the sheer size and relative simplicity of the American farming machinery. He witnessed tractors larger than any he had ever seen, efficiently tilling fields so immense they would constitute an entire Kreis, a district, in Germany. The American approach was always about maximizing output and minimizing labor, using machine power as a replacement for manpower. In Germany, manpower was expendable, but machines were precious. In America, machines were a disposable commodity designed for maximum production. This inverted philosophy was the economic engine of their defeat. The shock was often profoundly cultural. Nazi ideology had painted America as a nation weakened by its multi-ethnic nature, an uncoordinated mix of immigrants and cultures. What the prisoners encountered, especially in the camps and on work details, was a functional, if imperfect, democracy whose industrial might was drawn from a highly motivated, unified workforce. They saw American civilians who spoke freely, read uncensored newspapers, and enjoyed a degree of personal liberty that was utterly alien to the rigidly controlled Nazi state. This comparison was not lost on the camp authorities. While initially slow, the U.S. Army later implemented extensive re-education programs, known internally as the Special Projects Division, designed to counter years of Nazi indoctrination. They targeted the leaders and the highly educated prisoners first, exposing them to uncensored German films, lectures on American democracy, and tours of industrial facilities where possible. The goal was to create a core of denazified men who could return to Germany as catalysts for democratic reconstruction. But the most effective re-education came not from lectures, but from the reality of the American economy. Consider the simple observation of the American car. Many German officers who came from the landowning or educated classes possessed a general understanding of engineering. In Germany, only the elite drove high-quality, precision-built automobiles like Mercedes or BMW. In America, the POWs saw a nation where the average factory worker owned a personal car, a large, powerful Ford or Chevrolet, a symbol of luxury that in Europe was reserved for high-ranking officers or industrialists. They saw massive highways and filling stations that dwarfed anything in Europe, all built to support an automotive culture that had transformed a continent. The German system relied on horses and requisitioned civilian vehicles for logistics. The American system moved on gasoline and mass-produced military trucks. The casual American consumption of fuel and material goods, even under wartime rationing, spoke volumes. It illustrated a massive underlying resource base, oil, rubber, steel, cotton, that Germany simply did not possess and could never conquer. This disparity in resources and production translated directly to the battlefield and its human cost. The Allied strategy was a war of attrition where American lives were being saved by a crushing superiority of material. The endless flow of ammunition, fresh vehicles, medical supplies, and food meant that the American soldier, the GI, could be replaced, resupplied, and reinforced far more quickly than his German counterpart. The prisoner of war experience, therefore, became a profound, forced lesson in macroeconomics and military strategy. They learned that the war was not lost because of a failure of courage or an absence of German tactical genius. It was lost because the Reich had made a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of total war against a truly industrialized, resource-rich, and continent-sized power. Germany's economy had always been geared towards self-sufficiency and quick, localized conquest. America's was geared toward global industrial domination. America's industrial domination was not merely an economic factor, it was a psychological weapon that completely shattered the German worldview. For the average Lanzer, the common German soldier, the revelation was less intellectual and more visceral, tied directly to the quality of life he experienced in captivity. Under the provisions of the Geneva Convention, German POWs were given food equivalent to that of American troops, and often, the rations they received in the prison camps were significantly better than what their own families were receiving back home in a blockaded, bombed Germany. Some prisoners, having survived years on increasingly meager Wehrmacht rations, actually gained significant weight in American camps. One former prisoner, Siegfried Koster, recalled with grim humor that he gained 57 pounds in 2 years and often had a better diet than the American guards outside the wire. This material comfort, the almost insulting abundance of American life, stripped away the final layers of Nazi ideological justification. The regime had promised Lebensraum, living space, and a superior standard of life for the German folk. Yet, here as captives in the supposed decadent enemy's heartland, they were eating better, living more securely, and receiving better medical care than they had ever imagined possible in the final years of the war. The U.S. Army, while strictly adhering to the convention, utilized the POWs as contract laborers to offset wartime shortages, especially in agriculture. This put the Germans into direct, supervised contact with the American economy. They were paid a small wage in scrip, about 80 cents a day for enlisted men, which they could spend at the camp canteen. This exposure to work, wages, and trade, even under detention, modeled a free market system that stood in stark opposition to the centralized, increasingly dysfunctional command economy of the Third Reich. The experience of Wolfgang Wiegand, a captured U-boat radio man, serves as a powerful human story illustrating this systemic shock. Wiegand was sent to a camp in the Deep South and spent months working in a lumber mill. He remembered his shock at the American approach to natural resources. Where Germany meticulously managed its forests for generations of sustainable yield, Wiegand saw vast tracts of land cleared with astonishing speed and efficiency, the scale of the operation suggesting that America's resources were truly endless. He witnessed enormous mechanized cranes and specialized logging trucks that made the primitive, manpower-intensive efforts he had seen in Europe seem medieval by comparison. Wiegand later stated that it was the casual, effortless consumption of raw materials that convinced him of Germany's ultimate futility. "We saw a country that could make a new ship faster than we could sink an old one," he noted. The greatest psychological blow, however, came from a seemingly small detail: the American women. German propaganda had portrayed American women as weak, fashion-obsessed, and incapable of contributing to a serious war effort. When German prisoners worked on farms or were transported past industrial centers, they saw American women driving enormous trucks, welding ship hulls, and operating complex machinery in the factories, the Rosie the Riveters, whose labor underpinned the entire production miracle. These women were not only performing vital work, but they were doing so while maintaining a degree of personal freedom and style that suggested a society not teetering on the edge of collapse, but thriving under duress. For the prisoners, the sight of a competent female factory worker or farm supervisor, a woman driving a combine harvester that dwarfed their Panzer, was a direct contradiction of the Nazis' rigid, deeply misogynistic view of female roles. It demonstrated a societal adaptability and a mobilization of all resources, human and industrial, that the Reich, hampered by its own narrow ideology, had been unable to achieve. This growing realization that the enemy was not only materially stronger but also fundamentally more efficient and resilient fed a quiet, spreading fear. It transitioned from an initial arrogance, the belief in the Übermensch fighting the Untermensch, to a dawning, crushing comprehension of strategic doom. The generals, in their debriefings and discussions within the high-security camps, grappled with the cold, hard data. They had underestimated not just American willingness to fight, but its sheer capacity to do so. The sheer, relentless logistics of a two-front war, which had utterly broken Germany, was being handled by America as a matter of routine. The war's end found these prisoners in a state of ideological vacuum. They had lost not just the war, but the very foundation of their belief system. The American experience had provided a real-world counter-narrative to the Nazi lie, that a free, democratic, and industrialized state could not only outproduce an authoritarian regime, but could also treat its enemies with a level of decency that upheld its moral claims. The impact of this captivity was long-lasting. Many of the hundreds of thousands who returned to Germany, once repatriated, became quiet advocates for the reconstruction of a democratic German state, carrying with them the indelible memory of American abundance and capability. They had seen the true source of American power, and it was not in a single brilliant weapon, but in the relentless, terrifying, and overwhelming churn of its assembly lines. They had crossed the Elbe and the Atlantic, and in doing so had finally understood why their war, conceived in arrogance and predicated on the weakness of others, was lost. General-Lieutenant Dittmar, stepping onto the soil of the Allied line on that late April afternoon in 1945, looked out at a world that had not only defeated his army, but had also rendered its core ideology obsolete. He and his men had finally witnessed the terrible, unstoppable power of the arsenal of democracy, a force built not on conquest, but on the bedrock of a vast, unyielding industrial continent. The shock of what they saw in America was not the fear of a new weapon, but the cold realization that their enemy possessed the ability to endlessly manufacture victory, and that this, more than any battle, had shredded the German dream. April the 25th, 1945. Magdeburg, Germany. The Elbe River. The generals who surrendered on the edge of the collapsing Reich saw in the face of the American soldier not just a victor, but a small necessary part of an industrial engine so massive it had simply swallowed their entire world. The sheer scale of this defeat, the defeat of the imagination, was codified and amplified by the U.S. Army's intelligence apparatus. At sites like Fort Hunt, Virginia, codenamed P.O. Box 1142, the Americans had established a secret interrogation center. Here, high-ranking German prisoners, including scientists, U-boat commanders, and generals, were not tortured. They were simply listened to. Their casual, unguarded conversations, recorded by hidden microphones in their living quarters, provided a psychological X-ray of the crumbling German morale. These men, stripped of their rank and the rigid military hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, spoke freely about their core convictions, and the recordings reveal a pattern of deep, profound disbelief. They often returned to the same subject. The oil. Germany's entire military strategy had always been a desperate race for petroleum. From the Romanian fields to the drive toward the Soviet Caucasus, the war was fueled by a relentless, gnawing shortage. The Allies understood this vulnerability and deliberately targeted synthetic oil plants and refineries across the Reich in 1944. A captured general-lieutenant, discussing the war's strategic failure with a colleague at Fort Hunt, lamented that the Allied air offensive was not just about bombs, but about paralyzing logistics. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them, that America's oil reserves were essentially boundless. They spoke of the American forces in Europe, armored divisions, massive truck convoys, aircraft that operated as if fuel were water. This operational freedom, this lack of logistic fear, was the antithesis of the German experience. For the German generals, every barrel of fuel was a tactical decision. For the Americans, it was merely an input in the endless stream of war material. This observation extended to the American engineer and the machine tools that defined their industrial base. German industry prided itself on the precision of its machine tools. Heavy, durable, and highly complex instruments built to last for generations. The American factory, by contrast, embraced rapid tooling and replacement. The general-lieutenant in charge of German tank maintenance knew that every damaged lathe or press in a German factory meant months of lost production. He saw photographs, shown deliberately by American intelligence, of the vast, temporary nature of American war production. Factories that were quickly retooled, rapidly expanded, and designed for a single purpose, to mass-produce war material to a sufficient standard, then discard the factory and move on. The German system pursued technical perfection. The American system pursued overwhelming operational readiness. When the German engineers saw the simplicity of the M4 Sherman's engine block, designed for easy maintenance and mass assembly, they initially scoffed at its crude nature. Yet, they slowly realized the terrifying genius of the design. Its simplicity meant they could stamp out 20 for every one of their highly complex Tigers, and those 20 could be repaired or replaced on the front line faster and easier. One human story crystallizes this mechanical revelation. The experience of Hermann Göring's personal driver, a highly skilled civilian mechanic who was captured in Italy. This man, whose name we know from archive records only as Joseph, had spent years maintaining Göring's fleet of custom-built, luxury automobiles and staff cars, vehicles that required precision parts and constant expert attention. When Joseph was assigned work detail at an Army motor pool in Ohio, he expected to see similar meticulous maintenance procedures. Instead, he encountered the brute force efficiency of the American military logistics system. If a part on a 2.5-ton truck broke, the mechanic did not spend hours carefully repairing it. He simply ripped out the entire defective component, engine, transmission, whatever it was, and slammed a completely new assembly into the vehicle, often in under an hour. Joseph later told his guards, through a camp interpreter, that the realization hit him like a physical blow. In Germany, the vehicle was precious, and the mechanic's time was expendable. In America, the mechanic's time was precious, and the component was expendable. This philosophy of expendable quality and mass redundancy was the secret to the sustained Allied advance across Europe. The American army did not need to be smarter or tougher. It simply needed to be able to replace its losses, both men and material, at a rate that crushed the enemy's capacity for resistance. The effect of this reality on the indoctrinated Waffen-SS prisoners was particularly intense. These were the men who represented the ideological core of the Nazi state, often drawn from the most fervently nationalist youth. Placed in segregated camps to prevent them from terrorizing the ordinary Wehrmacht prisoners, they initially maintained their outward fanaticism. They organized secret courts, harassed defeatists, and sought to preserve the purity of the Führer's vision. But even their rigid beliefs were eroded by the unavoidable physical reality of their surroundings. In places like Camp Hearn, Texas, these hardliners were housed in wooden barracks that, while Spartan, were clean, weatherproof, and heated. They ate well, they received reading materials, and they could, if they chose, pursue educational courses, all guaranteed by the Geneva Convention, which, to their astonishment, the decadent Americans actually respected. Their experience stood in stark contrast to the brutal reality of the German war machine. The Reich had built its entire philosophy on a belief that international law was weakness and that only total dominance mattered. Now they were on the receiving end of an enemy that proved its moral superiority simply by following the rules, a decency that cost them nothing, yet provided powerful, quiet propaganda. The American treatment of the POWs, humane, distant, and professional, reinforced the image of a secure, powerful nation. There was no desperate need for vengeance, no shortage of resources that required them to starve their prisoners. The American guards were simply doing a job, backed by an industrial state so confident in its ultimate victory that it could afford to be charitable. This lack of hysteria, this casual confidence, was perhaps the deepest psychological blow. The SS men saw no signs of the internal collapse their leaders had promised. They saw only a well-ordered, confident nation functioning with minimal military interference on the home front. Their conviction, built on the promise of German exceptionalism and the decadence of others, shredded under the weight of this material and moral reality. The war was lost not just in the mud of the Eastern Front or the wreckage of the Reich, but in the glaring, overwhelming daylight of American success. This was the quiet, invisible victory that changed the post-war world, the creation of hundreds of thousands of involuntary, shocked German witnesses to the efficacy of the democratic industrial state. These men, once repatriated, would carry that truth home, proving that their defeat was not an accident of history or an act of betrayal, but the inevitable consequence of challenging a power that simply redefined the scale of war.